and I forgot to say that, so now I'm going to go back to her bio, but I was like, let me make sure that I get that in. Okay. Angela Davis is she was a DC public defender and was the executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition. She's the author of Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor, which won the Pauline Rule Moore Award. Currently, Davis is a professor of law at Washington College of Law at American University. She is the editor of Policing the Black Man. Please join me in welcoming Angela J. Davis to the Atlanta History Center.
Thank you, Kate. And I want to thank the Atlanta History Center for having me this evening, and I want to thank all of you for coming out. It's great to see so many familiar faces. I see people I know and people I don't know. I'm happy to see everyone, and so grateful that so many of you want to hear about this issue and talk about this issue, so thank you so much for being here. I want to start out by just talking a little bit about how this book came about. I was approached about 2.5 years ago about doing a collection of essays that would explore and contextualize the many awful killings of unarmed black men and boys that have occurred in recent years. And when I was approached and asked, I seized the opportunity, because there's no issue more important to me than the unfair treatment of black and brown people in the criminal justice system in America today. In fact, it's the issue that keeps me up at night. I thought about who I would ask to join me in this project, and I decided to reach out to the authors, lawyers, scholars, advocates, and activists who've been teaching and writing about, litigating, advocating, and agitating, and in many instances living this issue. And I was really fortunate that so many of them said yes. So I really want to just take this opportunity to thank them, the many authors that contributed to this project. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them and about the essays this evening. But the first thing I want to do is read a brief excerpt from the book's introduction that I hope will give you a sense of what the book is about. Why this book and why now? Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sam DuBose, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and Terrence Crutcher are just some of the names on a long list of unarmed black boys and men who were killed by police officers in recent years. Although black men have been the victims of violence at the hands of the state since the time of slavery, technology and social media now permit us to literally bear witness to many of these killings repeatedly. Millions of people have watched the video of a police officer choking Eric Garner to death as he struggled for air. Similarly, millions have watched the video of a police officer shooting Walter Scott in the back as he ran for his life. Who can ever forget the grainy footage of Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was shot by a police officer while he played alone with a toy gun in a park near his home? Two videos, one from a police helicopter and another from a police dashboard camera, show Terrence Crutcher walking away from police officers with his hands raised high in the air just before he was shot and killed. These images have evoked feelings of fear, sadness, and outrage, and serve as a reminder that the lives of black men and boys continue to be devalued and destroyed with impunity at the hands of the state. To date, not one of the police officers who killed these men and boys has been convicted of a single crime. From the arrival of the first slaves in Jamestown in 1619 to the lynchings of the 19th and 20th centuries to the present day, black boys and men have been unlawfully killed by those who were sworn to uphold the law and by vigilantes who took the law into their own hands. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened its doors on September 24, 2016, includes exhibits that tell the story of many of these killings. Yet these killings are not just a part of African American history. They have continued well into the 21st century, almost 400 years after the beginning of slavery, and persist with remarkable frequency and brutality during a time when America elected its first African American president. Many of these race-based killings have inspired and reinvigorated movements for change. The brutal killing of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955, the murder of civil rights activist Medgar Evers in 1963, and the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 all serve as markers on the civil rights movement timeline, as did so many other killings of black men by white racists. Each tragic killing sparked nationwide protests and renewed activism in the struggle for civil rights and racial justice in the United States. The killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012 was a pivotal marker of racial violence against black men in the 21st century. Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, a white man who called the police when he saw Martin walking in his neighborhood. Zimmerman, a member of a neighborhood crime watch group, reported to the police that Martin looked suspicious and that he looked like he was, quote, up to no good or on drugs or something, unquote. Ignoring the dispatcher's warning that he should not follow Martin, Zimmerman ultimately shot and killed him. Martin was unarmed and was on his way back to his father's house after buying snacks at a local convenience store. Initially, Zimmerman was not even charged with a crime, but after nationwide protests, he was charged with Martin's murder. A jury ultimately acquitted him. The killing of Trayvon Martin, the initial failure of the prosecutor to charge Zimmerman with a crime, and Zimmerman's ultimate acquittal captured the attention of the nation. President Obama even weighed in, stating, quote, Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago, unquote. Martin's killing also inspired the phrase, Black Lives Matter. The phrase trended on Twitter and all forms of social media and was displayed on posters carried in protests after Martin's killing and after every killing of a black man or woman by a police officer from that day forward. Black Lives Matter ultimately became a social justice movement with chapters throughout the United States and Canada. Many unarmed black men and boys have been killed since Trayvon Martin's tragic death 5 years ago. Many of the killings occurred after police officers arguably engaged in racial profiling, stopping and harassing these men for no explainable reason other than the color of their skin. In all of the cases where black men were shot and killed, the officers claimed that they felt threatened, even though the men were unarmed and often running away or retreating. In almost all of the cases, the police officers were never arrested or charged with a crime. The tragic killings of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, and others served as the catalyst for this anthology. But these killings also inspired the contributing authors to think about all of the ways that black men are policed in the broad sense of the word, heavily and harshly at every step of the criminal process. In fact, black men are policed and treated worse than their similarly situated white counterparts at every step of the criminal justice system, from arrest through sentencing. These unwarranted disparities exist whether black men are charged with crimes or are victims of crime. Police officers stop, search, and arrest black men far more frequently than white men engaged in the same behavior. Prosecutors charge black men more frequently and with more serious crimes than white men who engage in the same behavior. And there are disproportionate numbers of black men in the nation's prisons and jails. Criminal defendants, regardless of their race, are punished less harshly when their victims are black men. This anthology explores and explains the policing of black men from slavery to the present day and at every stage of the criminal process and beyond. Now, many people have asked, why black men? Why are you focusing on black men? Aren't there other people in the criminal justice system who are treated not well or treated poorly? And the answer to that is yes. So how would I answer that question? Black men are not the only people of color to be treated worse than their similarly situated white counterparts at every step of the criminal process. Black women, Latino men, Native Americans, and other people of color also experience violence at the hands of the state and discriminatory treatment in the criminal justice system, as do people who are gay, lesbian, and/or transgender. This book's focus on Black men in no way trivializes the experiences of all people who face these harms. While acknowledging that other groups have been and continue to be oppressed and discriminated against, this book focuses on Black men. In many ways, the experience of Black men in the criminal justice system is unique. The most noticeable difference is that they are impacted more adversely than any other demographic in the United States at every step of the process. Black boys are disproportionately arrested and detained. Black boys are more likely to be referred to the juvenile justice system than any other children. Over half of the students arrested at school in the United States and referred to the juvenile justice system are Black and Hispanic. And while Black students represent only 16% of students' enrollment, they represent 27% of students referred to law enforcement and 31% of students subjected to school arrests. Black male students alone make up 18% of all referrals and arrests. Black men are disproportionately arrested. African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be arrested than whites, and 49% of Black men, almost half, can expect to be arrested at least once by age 23. Black men are more likely to be killed or injured during a police encounter. While more whites are killed by law enforcement than people of color, African Americans are killed at a disproportionate rate. In fact, Black men are 21 times more likely to be killed by police than white men. Black men are disproportionately imprisoned and receive longer sentences. African Americans make up approximately 35% of the prison population in the United States, 35%. And by the end of 2015, Black men constituted 34% of the American prison population. In 2015, 5,165 in 100,000 Black men ages 25 to 29 were imprisoned, as compared to 2,165 Hispanic men and 921 white men of the same age. Remarkably, the number of Black men in prison or jail, on probation or on parole by the end of 2009 roughly equaled the number enslaved in 1850. 1 in 3 Black men born in 2001, 1 in 3, can expect to be incarcerated in his lifetime. Blacks are also disproportionately sentenced to death. As of 2014, the national death row population was approximately 42% Black, while the overall Black population is only 13.6%. So for all of those reasons, this anthology focuses on the plight of Black men and boys. The extraordinarily disproportionate mistreatment of Black boys and men at every step of the criminal process is explored in depth in this book. As the essays make clear, the issues and problems are complex, as are the solutions. The authors that I invited to join me in this project are scholars, lawyers, and activists who have studied and in some instances personally experienced the phenomenon about which they write. So in their essays, they examine and explain the policing of Black men. I want to tell you a little bit about the essays, and then I want to talk about my own essay, my own contribution to the book, which is about the prosecution of Black men, and talk to you about why I think that issue is so important. So just briefly, I'll tell you the titles, and hopefully they will inspire you to want to pick up the book and read it. The first essay is called A Presumption of Guilt, The Legacy of America's History of Racial Injustice, and it was written by Bryan Stevenson. The second essay is The Endurance of Racial Disparity in the Criminal Justice System by Mark Maurer. It's the head of the Sentencing Project in D.C., I should say. Bryan Stevenson, I heard some of you comment so you know who he is, a remarkable hero of mine who runs the Equal Justice Initiative. The third essay is called Boys to Men, The Role of Policing in the Socialization of Black Boys, written by Professor Kristen Henning of Georgetown. And this, I will tell you all this, that this essay almost didn't make it to the book because I was so focused on black men. And then after talking to Chris, as one of the nation's top leading experts on the juvenile justice system, I realized, wow, of course we have to talk about black boys. And that chapter is remarkable because actually black boys are treated worse in the system than black men. And so that essay is pretty revealing. The next one is called Racial Profiling, the Law, the Policy, and the Practice, written by Professor Renee McDonald Hutchins of the University of Maryland. Racial profiling is how so many of these killings start, and it explains it. The next chapter is Black Men and the Police, Making Implicit Bias Explicit. Now, I know many of you may have heard about implicit bias. It's a theme that goes through all of these essays and is at the root of so many of these killings, and I'll talk a bit about that tonight. It was written by Professor Catherine Russell Brown of the University of Florida. The next chapter is called Policing, a Model for the 21st Century by Professors Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler. Professor Mears served on President Obama's task force on policing in the 21st century. The next chapter is my own chapter. It's called The Prosecution of Black Men. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight. Then The Grand Jury and Police Violence Against Black Men by Professor Roger Fairfax. A lot of people were introduced to the grand jury after Ferguson when they realized that the police officer wouldn't be indicted. So Professor Fairfax explains the whole history of the grand jury and reveals some things that will probably be very surprising to many of you who witnessed what happened with a lot of these police officers. Very different for ordinary citizens with the grand jury. The next chapter is called Elected Prosecutors and Police Accountability by Professor Ron Wright. I focus a lot on electing good progressive prosecutors, and that chapter will be revealing when it talks about how prosecutors are elected. And the next chapter is called Do Black Lives Matter to the Courts? And it was written by Sherrilyn Ifill, who is the Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and also by Jen He Lee, who co-authored the chapter with her. She's a staff attorney there. Talks about the law and the history of the law, and it will reveal a lot about why it's so difficult, why the courts are not exactly friendly to claims of discrimination anymore, and many other issues. And the final chapter is called Poverty, Violence, and Black Incarceration by Jeremy Travis and Bruce Western. So those are the essays. And I want to spend the remainder of my time before opening it up for questions talking about my own contribution to the volume, which is called The Prosecution of Black Men, and also, if there's time, a little bit about these killings and you know, how is it, why is it, how could it be that these police officers have not been held accountable? I think that's a question I get, and I'm not sure I know the answer, but would like to explore and talk about what I think some of the issues are. But a bit about my chapter. Kate mentioned that I've spent a lot of my time writing about prosecutors, and I have. And the reason for that is that prosecutors are actually the most powerful officials in our criminal justice system. I mean, there's always been a lot of focus on police officers, and rightly so. We know there should be a focus given all that has been going on. And by the way, just to stress, and I mentioned this before, the killings of black men didn't start with Trayvon Martin. This has been going on since slavery. And so Bryan Stevenson's chapter lays that out and explains that so well. And so of course there should be a focus on police officers. Police officers have a tremendous amount of power and discretion on the street to stop people, to search them, and the law makes it very easy for them to do that. But I think people should focus also on prosecutors, and I don't think people have been focusing on them a lot. They are the most powerful officials in our criminal justice system. Police officers absolutely have a lot of power to stop people on the street, search them, frisk them, arrest them. But police officers can only bring people to the courthouse door. It is the prosecutor who decides whether they remain entrenched in the system and end up with a criminal record and all of that. The prosecutor has so much to do with that. And that is because of the two powers they have, the charging decision and the plea bargaining decision. Those two decisions made by prosecutors almost predetermine the outcome of criminal cases. And why do I say that? Well, if a police officer arrests a person on the street, they can only recommend charges to the prosecutor. They don't decide whether the person is in the criminal justice system. They can bring a case to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor can decide to take it, and prosecute the case, or they can dismiss it. It's totally up to the prosecutor. Even if there's probable cause to believe the person committed the offense, and that's the standard, the very low standard of probable cause is what the standard is for charging a person, more probable than not, very easy to show that, much lower than the much higher proof beyond a reasonable doubt that they need to convict. So a prosecutor can decide to charge a person at that point, or they can decide not to charge the person. It's totally within their discretion. And they are accountable to no one but the chief prosecutor of that office, right? And that decision is made behind closed doors, right? That's not a public decision. Prosecutors don't make a public announcement, I'm charging this person and I'm not charging that person, and here's why. They're not required to do that, and they don't do that. They make those decisions behind closed doors. So you can see when there's that much discretion and power, that's where disparities can come in, and where they do, right? If a prosecutor, can see one kid brought in, let's say he's arrested with 5 bags of cocaine, the prosecutor's got a lot of options there. The police officer might say, well, he's got 5 bags of cocaine. Why don't you charge him with possession with intent to distribute cocaine, which is a felony offense that in most states carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5, 10, sometimes more years. Mandatory minimum, meaning that if the person is convicted, they must serve all of that time, no matter what. So the prosecutor looking at a potential defendant with 5 bags of cocaine can charge 5 counts, can charge 5 counts of possession with intent to distribute, can charge the felony. But they also can just simply charge a misdemeanor possession. Even though they may have the evidence for the felony, they can say, I think I'll just charge the misdemeanor. Or they can just dismiss it and say, I'm not charging at all. They have the discretion to do any of those things, and they do not have to explain those decisions to a judge or anyone else. It's made behind closed doors. The chief prosecutor is the only person who's in charge of that. That's a tremendous amount of power if you think about it, right? Because if one kid comes in and he sees one kid, he says, well, I remember when I was back in college, I used to sell a little dope and youthful indiscretion, and I turned out all right, and that kid, this kid over here looks like, a kid who looks a certain way, reminds me of me when I was young. And he's got a future, and I don't want to ruin that future with a criminal record, so I'm going to let this slide. Whereas another kid comes in looking very different, from a very different neighborhood, right? And he's automatically, maybe he'll charge him with the felony. That's a tremendous amount of power. And the thing about it is it's complicated, because I'm not saying that prosecutor is saying, that's a rich white kid, I'm going to give him a break. That's a poor black kid, I'm not. They may not even be consciously thinking that way. And that's when this thing called implicit bias comes in, right? These unconscious feelings and views that we all, every one of us in this room of all races and genders have, right? The unconscious views that we all have based on negative stereotypes that we pick up in society around us, in the media and everywhere, right? Could be based on race or gender or skin color or hair or body size. We're not even aware we have those biases. It's that thing that makes some people, when a black man walks on the elevator, they don't even realize their body's moving over to the corner, right? And not just white folk, by the way, right? I don't know if anybody remembers. I know this is on C-SPAN, Reverend Jackson. Don't be mad at me, but I don't know if you all remember years ago when Reverend Jackson came out that he was walking down the street in Washington, D.C., and he said he looked behind him and was relieved to see that it was a white man. Reverend Jackson, who I used to work for and who I love, but my point is that all of us carry these implicit biases. The problem is that when people have tremendous power in the criminal justice system, and they are making decisions that are impacted by that implicit bias, that's a dangerous thing, right? Because you have someone's life and liberty in your hands, and you're being influenced by your unconscious views. You're not even realizing what you're doing, but yet it's happening, right? And the fact that it's unintentional doesn't mean it's okay. The fact that it's unintentional doesn't mean that the result is going to be different. It's still wrong if someone is treated unfairly. If these two young men, similarly situated, right, both of them charged with the same thing, maybe neither one of them had a record, because that's one of the things that prosecutors take into account, right? Or maybe the black kid did have an arrest record, but guess what? None of those cases actually, he wasn't convicted. Why? Maybe because they were the result of racial profiling and there wasn't a case there. So there's all kinds of complicated things that go into that charging decision. Same thing with plea bargaining. So if you all watch that show, well, there are many Law and Order shows. I guess there's about 8 or 9 of them. If you watch any of the many Law and Order shows, you think all of these trials are going on. Not so in the criminal justice system. There are not a lot of trials going on. There are a lot of guilty pleas going on. 95% of all criminal cases are resolved by way of a guilty plea. 95%. Only 5% of criminal cases actually go to trial with a jury and all that. And that process, the plea bargaining process, is, again, totally controlled by prosecutors. So how does it work? Prosecutor says, okay, I'm going to charge you with 5 counts of burglary. And that's the other thing. There's this phenomenon of overcharging. They may not even be sure they can prove all of those burglaries beyond a reasonable doubt, but they sure can charge them, because all they have to do to charge them is to show probable cause, like more likely than not. So they pile on all these charges, and it gives them an advantage at the plea bargaining stage. All right, you're facing, let's make it a harder case. Let's say it's drugs again, with 5 mandatory minimum charges. You're looking at 50 years on the bottom, meaning like you're going to have, if you're convicted after trial, you're going to have to serve 50 years before you see the light of day. Tell you what, says the prosecutor, I'll make you a deal. I'll allow you to plead to one of these 10-year mandatory minimum offenses, and I'll dismiss the other 4. Sounds like a good deal, right? You can see how even an innocent person would plead guilty, because going to trial is risky business. Even if you're innocent, you could be found guilty. And so many poor people, most of the people in the criminal justice system are poor people. Many of them have overworked public defenders or court-appointed attorneys. Many who are good lawyers but don't have the resources to investigate the cases, to find a defense, right? So anything could happen in trial. So even an innocent person under those circumstances might be compelled to feel like they should plead guilty. And so many people do, 95%. And I'm not saying plea bargaining is a bad thing. If it were fair, it would be fine. And by that I mean this. A lot of times these plea offers are made, like a prosecutor can come up to the defense attorney and say, I tell you what, I'll give your guy a deal, but it expires at 5 o'clock today. He either agrees to take the plea, or it's off the table. And the defense attorney might say, well, wait a minute. I have an ethical duty to investigate these charges, to find out whether my client has a defense. How can I advise my client to do this and I don't even know? And too bad. That's not illegal, actually, folks, in our criminal justice system. That's not the way justice is supposed to work, but it goes on every day in courtrooms across the country, where a defense attorney is going to the client saying, look, I don't know, you might have a defense, but they're making this offer, and the decision is up to the client. That's not the way justice is supposed to look. Now, if the plea bargaining process worked in a way that the prosecutor says, here's my file, here's all the evidence I have against you, here's everything I know about the case, and I'm going to give you time to investigate, and then you let me know whether you want to take the plea. That happens sometimes. I'm not saying all prosecutors act the way that I mentioned before, but many of them do. That is the system that we have in a lot of jurisdictions, where there's a lot of pressure on everybody to move the cases along, clear the calendar. Judges love pleas. I apologize if there are any judges in the audience. Judges love pleas, because pleas only take a few minutes. Trials take sometimes days, and they've got to move that calendar, right? But there's a human being behind all of that, right? So you can see why I think prosecutors are the most powerful individuals in the criminal justice system. And I could go on and on in the interest of time. I won't. But I will say this one more thing about prosecutors. You know, the problem is, and I talk to some of my prosecutor friends, and they say, look, and because I say to them, you know, you guys make these decisions behind closed doors. You're not accountable to the public. People don't know what you're doing. There are racial disparities that you're causing, maybe not intentionally, but you are. And they will say, well, look, if my constituents don't like me, they can just vote me out. And I say, well, somebody thinks that's funny. In theory, right? We live in a democracy, and you know, we hold those accountable to whom we grant power, and the prosecutors are the most powerful. Democracy is all about transparency, and there is no transparency in the prosecution function when it comes to charging and plea bargaining. Those decisions, as I said, are made behind closed doors. So most state and local prosecutors, and I should say that they are federal prosecutors, those are the U.S. attorneys that are over the federal districts, and then there are state and local prosecutors. Only about 10% of all criminal cases are handled on the federal level. Only 10%. 90% of all criminal cases are handled on the state and local level. So there are thousands of state's attorneys, district attorneys, they're called different things in different jurisdictions out there. And they're elected. There are only 5 jurisdictions. 4 states in the District of Columbia do not have elected prosecutors. They have another process. But all the rest of them, they're elected. They run for office. And it's a very imperfect system of accountability. Because in Ron Wright's chapter, you'll read about how many prosecutors, they serve for decades, run unopposed. People go to the ballot box in an election year, and sometimes there's only one name there because people don't challenge them. And when they do try to challenge an incumbent, it's almost impossible to unseat them. And when they run for office, they're not talking about the stuff I'm talking about here today, right? They're not saying to their constituents, they're not saying, here are my plea bargaining policies, and here are my charging policies, and here's what I'm doing about racial disparities in the criminal justice system. I doubt if you've heard any DAs run on that. They, in the past anyway, and still so in most jurisdictions, they run on, I'm tough on crime. And if they have an opponent, they'll say, I'm tougher on crime. And they don't really talk about what they do, these really important decisions that they're making behind closed doors. And so that's why it's so important that we all educate ourselves so we can ask the hard questions. I bet if you would go to a forum put on by a prosecutor and raise your hand and say, what are your charging and plea bargaining policies, they would faint right there at the podium. And I urge you to do that. You should ask that question, right? But I say to you, it's really important to pay attention to your district attorney races. It's really important for good people who care about justice in the criminal justice system to run for office. And I'm happy to say in 2016, a number of prosecutors were challenged around the country and were unseated. Not that many, but some, and a lot of attention has been paid to them. Kim Fox in Chicago, Aramis Ayala in Orlando, Florida, and I could go on and on. So there is a movement, I think, of people paying more attention to prosecutors and what they do. And I'm happy to hear that. I think it's really important that we pay attention to that. And I just want to close again with some statistics and then open it up for questions. You know, the United States criminal justice system is the largest in the world. At the end of 2011, approximately 7 million individuals were under some form of correctional control in the United States, including 2.2 million incarcerated in federal, state, or local prisons and jails. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, dwarfing the rate of nearly every other nation. Racial minorities are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they're more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, they are more likely to face stiff sentences. African American males are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white males, than their similarly situated white counterparts, and 2.5 times more likely than Hispanic males. If the current trends continue, 1 of every 3 Black American males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as can 1 of every 6 Latino males, as compared to 1 of every 17 white males. So we have a problem in this country today, right? It's not a badge of honor to be number 1 in incarceration in the world. It's a badge of shame, right? Why is it that we're so different from every other country in the world? Why are we doing this so differently? And why do we have these horrible racial disparities? As I've tried to explain tonight, it's complicated. There are a lot of complex reasons why. But at the end of the day, it's an unjust and unfair system, and we all have to fight to change it. So thank you for hearing me out, and I'd be happy to take the questions.
If you'll come to the microphone so it doesn't appear as though Professor Davis is talking to herself. We need to hear your question.
I've often found that the saddest picture that I've seen during the Civil Rights Movement, and I was in the Civil Rights Movement, is men carrying signs saying, "I am a man."
Yes.
It's so painful to watch that. I believe that in police-involved shootings, the person is not seen as human and is feared at once, whether running away, whether nude, whether with or without a weapon. Whose responsibility is it to change that perception? It's not a training issue. It's not a culture or police issue. Who can fix it? Because that, to me, is so central, that if you will shoot someone who's nude, as happened in our state, someone who's running like Walter Scott, unarmed people, Philando Castile. I mean, it's so painful to see that. And then you look at how Dylan Roof was treated, and he had killed 9 people. So I'm just wondering, whose job is it, whose responsibility is it to fix it so that when you see this person, unarmed or not, this African-American male is a human being.
Yes.
And deserves respect and value.
Yes. Thank you so much for that very insightful question and statement. I mean, what you said, you knew this already, that what you just said is in a lot of the essays, actually. It's really scary and sad and depressing that for Black men and boys, their very existence, right? They can be doing nothing, standing on the street corner, talking, just being, right? Just living, creates suspicion in the minds of certain people. They see Black and they see criminal or not human. You just said that, and that's so true. In several of the chapters, the chapter on implicit bias, Chris Henning's chapter, which is by Catherine Russell Brown, Chris Henning's chapter on Black boys, they discuss these studies that are really quite shocking, that show, particularly police officers, to try to sort of gauge whether they have this implicit bias that I talked about before. Well, they'll show them these images of Black boys, and they repeatedly overestimate the age and size of Black boys, always seeing them as older and larger than they really are because of this bias immediately. That's what they see even when it's not there. Some of the police studies that were done in the chapter about implicit bias, where they would ask police officers, they showed them these images very quickly and asked them to respond, whether should they shoot or not shoot. They would see weapons in the hands of unarmed Black men and not see them in the hands of white men who were armed because of this implicit bias. These studies show this, right? So, it's an incredible burden to put on a Black boy or a man, quite frankly, to say, act a certain way. A lot of people in here have given their sons and daughters probably the talk. Don't talk back to the police officers, put your hands on the wheel, don't say. The thing that's scary and maddening and infuriating is that we saw in a lot of these videotapes, right, of, I believe it was Philando Castile's case, or we saw even in the other case, Tamir Rice was playing with a gun. I mean, they weren't doing anything wrong. So it's just, telling folks act a certain way is not going to save you all the time. And that's what's scary. So your question, what can we do about it? You say it's not a question of training. Well, actually, some of our scholars here think that is a big part of it. Because there is something called implicit bias training. And I know people hear about the diversity training, the eyes start to roll. I get it, because a lot of the training is like, not really, But there is really good training around implicit bias. That's why Catherine Russell Brown's chapter is called Making Implicit Bias Explicit, because what the studies show is that when you make people aware of their implicit biases, that's the first step in getting rid of it. So there's actually very good implicit bias training out here. There are a few people that are doing it. I recently went to sort of a conference on this in Washington, D.C., where they brought together many different people in the criminal justice system, parole folks, probation judges. And the woman who was doing the training, there's a specific training to try to root out. There's a judge, several judges now, who are giving instructions to jurors about implicit bias to make them aware of it before they make decisions. So I do think training is a big part of it, at least a step. Anyway, I'll stop there. We're going to go to this side now.
Can I talk in this? I don't hear. Can you hear? Oh, is it on?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Directly into it.
Okay. I am an elderly white woman, and I thought I didn't have any bias. But I've read this book, and I found that I have implicit inherited bias from slavery. And when I grew up, I think we have implicit bias from when we didn't think of a black person as a full person. We saw them as a half person, and I think that a lot of people glance over the fact that we might be biased. And I had to look straight at it. And it was uncomfortable. Sure. And I'm not there that yet, but I'm not a police officer. And and I believe now that police officers, and especially our prosecutor we have now, I hope he's not here.
I hope he is here.
Is very guilty of bias.
Thank you I really appreciate your comment. I do. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that you're here. I appreciate that you're reading the book. And you say you feel bad. You shouldn't feel bad, because what I said before is we all have implicit biases, people of every race. So thank you so much for your comment. Yes.
Gino Lloyd, thank you, Ms. Davis, for coming out, and I appreciate the racial makeup of the audience. Got a story, then a question. Sure. I was transporting an off-duty black officer to the airport, and and this issue came up. He told me my number one priority was to get out of the situation alive. He said, I'm not going to win anything out on that cop's domain. He said, if you want to fight in the courthouse. And then you showed me the uphill battle. Even in the courthouse, I would have uphill battle. But at least I'm alive. At least I'm alive to fight. And the question is, this disparity in our courtroom, would you call it a conspiracy? Is this a conspiracy? Is that a good word for it?
Okay. Thank you for the comment. Of course, I will say this about the comment of officers saying his number one priority is to get out of the situation alive. I think what we've got to do is train our police officers that you can get out of a situation alive without killing an unarmed person, right? None of these black men or boys had a weapon, and Philando Castile, when he said, I have it legally, here it is, I'm not reaching for it, my hands are out here, and he killed him anyway. So, yeah, I want police officers, we need police officers to protect us, we get that. But they don't have to kill people to stay alive. That's the main point. Your second question, is it a conspiracy? I don't think it's a conspiracy, because I think that most of it, maybe not all of it, some of it is intentional. I think some of it is intentional, but not all of it. And I'll give you an example of intentional. There was a case in New York City, it's written about in one of the essays, called Floyd versus New York City. Phenomenal case, not many people know about it. But the Center for Constitutional Rights sued the New York City Police Department because they were engaged in systematic, unconstitutional behavior. They were stopping and frisking and searching illegally black men and boys. And they were doing it intentionally because they had some police officers on the inside who wired themselves and caught them, police chiefs telling them to go and stop black boys. And so it was incredible. So without getting into the details, my point is not all of it is unintentional. But I do think a lot of it is the implicit bias. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't excuse it. It does not, because it still produces an injustice. What we got to do is figure out how to get to those biases, get rid of them, retrain people, and get rid of the people who refuse to do the job right. And it's really hard. It's really hard. It is hard to fire police officers. They have powerful unions, and interestingly enough, some of you may have seen Trump make that statement encouraging police officers to engage in police brutality, which is outrageous. I mean, I don't know why I continue to be shocked by things that he does, but I was shocked that someone who claims to be the President of the United States would say to the police, be rough. Basically, and then you had a lot of the heads of these police organizations to come out and say, actually, no, we don't, that's wrong. Police unions, they have not spoken against them. So anyway, I think we're over here now.
There's a big difference between a white person and a racist. A racist cannot be trained. They are steeped in their racism, dyed in the wool. They will never change. They have no intention of changing. So that's what you're working with. The ones who are ordinary white police officers who really, they do have implicit bias and they're willing to work with that, it takes a willingness, and they can be trained to do better. But it's never going to be eliminated. The racism is there. And even in the ones that we're talking about can be trained. They're racist as well. There was the blue-eyed, brown-eyed test that Elliot did, and she essentially, some of you are familiar with that. She essentially said that America's a racist country. You might as well face it up. I mean, that's what it is. You did a very excellent job of tracing from 400 years ago, a pattern of behavior. We've had plenty of opportunity to address it, but the malice is there, the intention to not address it. It's not to anyone's advantage who has power to address it. There's no incentive. It's not going to be addressed. There have been brilliant minds who have studied this. There is no hope. And so I know people don't like that. That is a grim picture, and that's the way it is. And also, as far as, basically that's it. If you keep looking at all the data, and you also keep looking at all the studies, you look at the longevity of what the racism has been, there is no cure for it. And I think that maybe people can unite and try to address it, but forget it. The racism is here. It's been here. It's part of the character of America. It will never go away. And you know it. If you want to be honest, then you can address it. Yeah. But if you want to just keep on playing games and being nice, and one other thing, genocide sounds like a conspiracy, but when you follow the statistics, the data, The genocide, economic devastation has been long-term and systemic. And it's not just the law enforcement and the justice system, which is very foul and unjust. It's America. This is what America is known for outside the borders, because this is what America is.
Thank you for your comment. I will say this. I agree with some of what you say. I disagree with others. I do have to have hope because I have a child and grandchildren, so I have to have hope. And there are some racist people who will never change, but there are some who will change, either because they get it or because they're made to change, right? So, some people decided, when there was desegregation that, they weren't going to go to school. They're not going to let their kids go to school. But guess what? They were made to do that because the law required them to do it. So if you don't want, or people who don't want to behave, or people who are acting unconstitutionally, or who are acting racist, get rid, you can't be in this position of power, is my point, And so what I think is that racism is always going to be in the United States. I know it's always going to be there, but I also think that some people do change, and I don't think that every person is a racist. I have to believe that. I also have to believe, in the change element again, because to say to people there is no hope, I'm not going to say that to little kids, black, brown boys and girls, that there's no hope, because what does that do to them? So I think we have to keep fighting for it. I think there are good-minded people out here who will change. I have to believe that. But that's my feeling. Yes.
Hi, Professor Davis, thanks so much for coming down to Atlanta. Really appreciate you down here. I'm wondering if when you were writing and publishing this book, if you've intended to or have had any interaction with law enforcement after the publication of the book. I don't know if you saw any of that out or if some of it came your way unintentionally,
Right.
But I'm curious about, maybe the unintended audience of this book and if there's been some dialogue there.
Right. Well, this is only my second big reading, so we'll see. But I have had interactions with a lot of prosecutors and talk about and so on, and police officers, because there are some police officers. There's an organization called NOBLE, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers, and I've known some of the leaders of that organization who actually agree with everything I'm saying, you believe it or not. So I think that there are some folks out there who know that there's a problem, that it needs to be changed, and not enough of them. So it'll be interesting to see. So far, I haven't gotten any. You all are a very friendly audience, so I appreciate that. Yes.
Hang on 1 second. I was going to
sorry.
say my boss isn't here, so I'm going to let the Q&A continue. We normally do, but I do want to make sure that you're asking a question and not a comment.
Thank you.
I wanted to for everyone else that said thanks a lot for coming, and I appreciate hearing this. You did a great job, stating the problem. And one of the things that, particularly when you talked about implicit bias, I'm interested in looking at solutions, and I agree with you also. I'm not about giving up hope. I do think that things can change. Things are always changing, okay? I'm an artist. I'm a working artist. And one of the things that I'm interested in, one of the things I'm dealing with right now, is that the same issues that you're dealing with. I'm also a father and a grandfather of young black men, okay? And so when I think about the implicit bias and the question I ask, where does it come from? One of the things that I think of, it may be very many areas that it comes from, but, subliminal messaging, I do think is important. And we could go back to looking at Birth of a Nation. We could look at all of those cartoons and the caricatures and all of the Sambo, imagery that was created. And not just white people were looking at that, but black people as well.
Yes.
So today, we're the byproduct of all of that.
Yes, exactly.
So in a way in which to change that implicit bias, in my mind, is look into the arts. Looking at filmmakers, looking at painters, at dancers, performers, poetry, etc. So I guess the question that I have, for you is what role do you see, the artists and the arts, in bringing about positive social change?
Right, you answered the question for a tremendous role, Arts, film, theater, Visual arts are so powerful and so important. Photography, photojournalism, there's so many examples of that. I think it plays an incredible role. You know, the arts move people emotionally. You mentioned subliminal messaging, and the negative ones were there. Yeah. No question but that the positive ones play a role, so keep making art. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I do have a question, but I also want to make just a very quick comment. I'm very sorry, but I do just want to say that I hope that everybody does continue to have hope, because I used to be extremely racist. I believed in bootstrap theory. I perpetuated the myth of the welfare queen, and enough people yelled at me to make me realize that these things are absolutely false. And I feel like I understand that it's sometimes really hard to have hope, but the onus shouldn't be on black people anymore to say, stop killing us. Like, it's really, I feel like we should have a louder voice in saying this has to stop, because we've spent enough time being biased and being very racist as well. So please don't, lose hope.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. But my question is that during Georgia's last legislative season, we had a bill introduced to the House. It was HB 116. And the purpose of the bill was to expand the number of crimes that juveniles could be charged with that were sent to Superior Court. And I found this really upsetting, because reading into it, I found that the crime was actually armed robbery. And I don't know about anybody else, but if I was the victim of an armed robbery, I wouldn't want to see a 15-year-old go to, an adult prison.
Unfortunately, a lot of people do, but go ahead.
But I am really curious if you know about whether there's a difference in the rate of recidivism versus when a juvenile is tried as an adult versus when they are sent to the juvenile justice system. And are there any programs in place that actually reduce the rate of recidivism in the juvenile justice system?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, let me just say something about the bill. I'm not familiar with the details of it, but the last thing we need is to create more crimes. The United States of America has so many, we criminalize everything. Everything. And sometimes there are 6 or 7 crimes that you can be charged with for the one same act. And a lot of times the titles of these crimes are scarier than some crimes. So you mentioned an armed robbery, okay? An armed robbery could be for juvenile or an adult. Just say a juvenile. Could be a group of kids. And because juveniles are I used to represent kids, and a lot of times they'd just be walking down the street. They don't think about, oh, I'm going to go rob somebody. It could be a group of them, they're walking down the street, and one of them like, oh, there's that lady, that purse, I'm going to grab a purse, and then they all start running, and the other one's with them. They don't know what's going on. They start running too. All of them are going to be charged with robbery. They're impulsive. They don't think ahead. And an armed robbery doesn't necessarily mean a gun, right? I have seen prosecutors who have charged people with assault with a dangerous weapon for kicking someone with a shoe on. And I had this charge with one of my clients in Washington, D.C. Assault with a dangerous weapon, shod foot. You know what a shod foot is? It's a foot with a shoe on it. And that was the weapon. You're laughing, but it's true. I don't know if you all remember the Gina 6 cases. One of those kids was charged with assault with a dangerous weapon, and the weapon was a shoe. So it gives you an example of how these crimes, I mean, sure, if somebody takes a gun out and points a gun at somebody, that's a dangerous crime. But not every armed robbery is that. Not every, so it's, But you get to the point of recidivism. I will just say this briefly because there's a long line. There's no question but that if you take a child and put a child in the adult system, they are not going to be rehabilitated. They are going to be made worse. It's not going to help them. It's not going to help society because they are going to get out at some point, and when they get out, they're going to be worse than when they went in. There are not rehabilitative programs for juveniles in adult prisons, period. There are not even rehabilitative programs in a lot of adult prisons for adults. And so we're talking about fixing people. And just to be clear, I know that there are serious crimes out here where some people are going to have to be locked up. Murders and rapes and so on. But just to be clear, the majority of folks are locked up for nonviolent offenses. The majority of people are not locked up for those offenses, right? The offenses that are filling our nations in jails with both juveniles and adults are not those crimes. And so that's what we really need to look at. There are programs out there for juveniles. In the interest of time, I won't go into them, but they're not inside adult prisons and not even inside juvenile facilities, which is why we've got to fight those kinds of bills. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate your fierce courage, because that's what it takes. This should be a dialogue for politicians, because every prosecutor in Georgia is elected.
Yes.
And thank you in your chapter for mentioning some of the people that we fought against here, not because we hated them, but because they didn't do correct things in the justice system. I was one of 7 people on the original Citizens Review Commission, but we didn't have independence. There are no more Citizens Review Commissions in Georgia, in spite of the horrific record of justice here. But what I wanted to mention is, of the 7 of us, 5 were attorneys. And I and one other person were the only ones demanded that the police chiefs come forward at least to answer a few questions about training. But because we did not have independence, the politicians picked the ones that we had. But I came on because of a neighborhood planning unit. But I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the way these things work. Please give us some hints in order, not just the vote, but to get independence for these, because otherwise here...
What are these review commissions? Are they reviewing police behavior?
Yes.
Or like a
yes, egregious police behavior first.
Yeah, right.
And it came about because they shot a black woman named Katherine Johnson, you might be familiar,
I do.
53 times, yes, and planted pot on her. Yeah. The only reason we know about that, is because the informant jumped out of a car under threat of his own life that had kept telling the 2 cops that did go to jail for a short time that that woman didn't sell dope. But they busted down the door and killed her. So that out of that, the uproar caused the Citizen Review Commission. But please tell us or give us some advice. How about to get some kind of independence? But the vote is the first part, because right, Paul Howard is not going to give us a just decision.
Thank you. I mean, I don't have the answer for you. I do appreciate what you're saying, because a lot of these civilian complaint review boards, which is what they're calling other jurisdictions, they don't have the power to really do anything to the cops because they don't have the independence. And, all I can say is that you're elected officials. I mean, you have to, that's why, democracy is ugly, particularly these days. It's very ugly, right? And it's hard and it's difficult. But that's the only way we can do it, is speak up and make our voices known to our elected officials and let them know what we, the people, want, right? And so that's about the only way to do it. It's a hard way of going about it, but I think that's the only way. Yes.
Well, thank you for being here, Ms. Davis. I appreciate that. The question I have is about the jury system. In these police killings that have gone to trial, the juries have not convicted them.
Yes.
I can't understand that.
Right.
That baffles me.
Yeah.
Is it implicit bias, or is it something else involved there?
Thank you for that question, because I wanted to answer that question, so thank you for asking it. That is something I've been thinking so much about. I can't really figure it out either, but I'm trying. So after some of these cases, Walter Scott, who was running away with his hands in the air, got shot in the back like an animal. We saw that with our own eyes because it was videotaped. We saw Eric Garner being choked to death with our own eyes. So it's hard when you see this with your own eyes and you see a murder, and I teach criminal law, so I know what a murder is when I see one. Those were murders. And then to have, in the case of Eric Garner, not even being charged. In the case of Walter Scott, the jury came back a hung jury. In the case of Betty Shelby in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 2 cameras showed her shoot down Terrence Crutcher with his hands up in the air, not guilty. So in that, they questioned some of the jurors after that. And I remember some of the jurors in several of these cases saying, oh, we were so sad because no one wins here. And we didn't have a choice because the law required us to find the person guilty. And I'm thinking, no, they didn't understand, because here's the deal. It is true that the law favors police officers. The Supreme Court, in a series of cases, starting with Tennessee versus Garner, Scott versus Harris, several others, I won't go into detail, but basically There's this real loose reasonableness standard that the Supreme Court has set. It's like if it's reasonable for the police officer to believe that they're in danger or someone else is in danger, they can use deadly force. And they allow police officers to use deadly force in a much wider range of circumstances than you and I. Because you and I, as ordinary citizens or residents, we have what's called self-defense. But it's really very clear, the law of self-defense. You have to be in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death before you can use deadly force. What does that mean? Imminent means somebody's got to be coming at you with a weapon before you can legally kill that person, because the law says you don't have to give up your life for another person. That's the law of self-defense. Not so for cops. There's no imminence requirement, first of all. They don't have to be in imminent danger of serious, and it doesn't have to be serious bodily injury or death. It's just safe. There's a loose safety, standard. It doesn't have to be imminent. And so the law gives them permission. But here's the thing. When those police officers testified in the few trials, because remember, most of these cops didn't go to trial because most of them weren't charged, but in the few that went to trial where there were acquittals, you heard these jurors saying this. What happened, I think, is that when the police officer got on the stand and said, I believe that I was about to be killed, even though the jurors saw, in some instances, videotapes where clearly the person wasn't coming at them, clearly there was no weapon, it didn't seem reasonable to me that they would feel that they were about to be killed. Why would you think you're about to be killed when the person had the hands up? Why would you think you're about to be killed if there was no weapon? So jurors are not required to believe testimony that's not believable. In fact, judges tell all jurors in all cases, you're the judge of the credibility of the witness. If the witness is not credible or saying something that's not believable, you can reject it. That applies to police officers too, but it just appears that they're believing it, right? Or if these police officers, because of their implicit bias, even though the person's not armed, are saying, I feel that I'm in danger, a juror could say, well, no, that's not reasonable. What you did was at a minimum reckless, and you're guilty. They could have said that. So the law didn't require them to do that. So I don't know if it's bad jury instructions. I don't know what's going on there, but it's a combination of the law and I think maybe a misunderstanding of what their jobs are. But again, so few of them have gone to trial that, but thank you for that question. It's complicated. Yeah.
Okay. In 2006, the FBI produced a report, you can see it online, but it's mostly redacted, that showed that there was a heavy white supremacist KKK presence within our police force. That report made specifically Republicans throw a hissy fit. They were just like, no, we can't have this. And so the report was shelved. They took another bite at the apple, the FBI, in 2009 with the Department of Homeland Security under Janet Napolitano. They said, okay, we have this problem. Because we have approximately 18,000 police forces around the country. It's very diffused. Mm-hmm. We have a problem with white supremacists infiltrating our police departments. We need to address this. Again, the Republicans threw a hissy. Janet Napolitano decided to be spineless and rejected the report out of hand. And it was shelved again. And there's nothing being addressed with this issue. I understand implicit bias, but we also have to talk about the presence of white supremacists. I mean, one person was accosted or shot by a police officer who was wearing a KKK T-shirt underneath his uniform. So I understand implicit bias, but then there's not even implicit racism. This is explicit racism. Absolutely. When are we going to deal with this?
I agree with everything that you've said. And there was a case of an officer in Washington, D.C. who was found wearing one of those T-shirts under his uniform as well. I agree it's not all implicit bias, and I appreciate you pointing that out. And when it's explicit like that, there is no excuse, because the law is not very helpful in helping us get rid of implicit bias, because as Sherrilyn Ifill and Jen Lee point out in their chapters, there's this requirement, this constitutional requirement of showing intentional discrimination before any remedies can be. There's no remedy for implicit bias, but there are legal remedies for explicit, clear racism. The question is, the charges have to be brought. The people need to be fired if it's that situation. No, I agree with you entirely. Yes.
Thank you for coming. You answered part of my question while I was standing here, but I'm in law enforcement and we're trained in Graham versus Connor, and I was going to ask you to elaborate on that, because that objective reasonable standard is what they're using to justify their use of force.
Yes.
And you answered part of it already, but if you want to give them the background, because when I was studying this case, I was just appalled.
We're talking about the case involving the kid who was diabetic.
Yeah, that's the original Graham. Yeah, that's the ruling. And so he was diabetic, and they thought he robbed a convenience store, and he did nothing, and he basically was beat up and attacked, and that's how the case became for the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, you just gave the facts basically, but that's one of the cases. Scott v. Harris is another case that involved police officers ramming a car. This case, this kid was having a diabetic shock situation. He ran to a 7-Eleven or something. He got into an altercation with the police, and they beat him up, basically, and he brought a claim. The Supreme Court said it was okay because the police officers acted reasonably, even though he was not doing that. Scott versus Harris, this person was in a car. It was a high-speed chase. He should not have been speeding, no question about it. Police officers came up behind him and rammed his car repeatedly, crushing him and turning him into a quadriplegic, right? Because they decided that they had to stop this car because he was speeding. And the Supreme Court said that was reasonable because he could have hurt some other people when he was speeding, so it was fine for the police officers to do that, even though it left him the way it did. So that's the law we're dealing with, and thank you for bringing out those cases. The law is bad for us. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go this side. Yeah.
We keep talking in circles about bad policy.
Can't hear you.
Oh. Can we hear?
Speak, I think we get a little closer. Go ahead.
We keep talking about bad policy in this country. And shallow though it may be, from time to time at high morality points, we've tried to legislate just that morality. Going back to the late Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, and even recently, equity in marriage for our gay brothers and sisters. But at this point for us, for black and brown bodies, what are our policy options? What is it that we should be articulating to legislators that we want specifically? Because we can say all day long, don't shoot me. And we can say all day long, you're over prosecuting me. But what are our policy options? What is the language we should be using?
Let me make sure I understand your question, because I guess it depends on which issue you're talking about, right? Are you talking about police use of deadly force? Are you talking about abuse of prosecution?
I guess it's more of a broad question. Maybe you can help me narrow it down myself. But I'm sitting and I'm thinking about us talking over and over again about the lack of prosecution of officers and how consistent it is for black and brown people to be convicted at a higher rate and have longer sentences at a higher rate. What is the language that we should be using to our legislators? Because we can stand in the street all day long and say, don't shoot. Right. And we can stand in the street all day long and say, I'm going to jail more frequently and longer. But that's not a solution.
Right. So a couple of things. Thank you for your question. I can't give you specific legislative language right now to use. It depends on the bill, depends on the issue, it depends on all those things. The last thing you said, though, it's important. The Black Lives Matter movement is so important. You know, people my age are like, oh, all the marching street. No, we need folk in the street marching and demanding. Because if you think for 1 minute that the laws and policies are going to be passed in the legislature without people out in the street, you're deluding yourself. We need both. It's not either or. We don't need folks in Black Lives Matter movement to say that those of us who are lawyers litigating and others who are in the legislature that we aren't important. And we don't need to be telling folks who are out there marching that. It's all, we know from history, it's always taken all of that, and it will continue to take all of that. what I get to is this. I do think we need new laws, but the bottom line is that, and it depends on the issue as to what language to use, and I could talk to you about that depending on your issue. But it also is very important, even when you've got good laws, if you've got bad people implementing the laws, it really doesn't matter. So what I'm focusing on now is with prosecutors, we got to get the bad prosecutors out and we got to get good progressive people in there. And it does make a difference. If you don't know who Kim Foxx is, with 2 X's, look her up. She's the new DA in Chicago. She unseated Anita Alvarez, who was the prosecutor when Laquan McDonald, another young black boy who was killed in the streets of Chicago. Anita Alvarez had a videotape that she sat on and wouldn't reveal that showed that that police officer killed Laquan McDonald unlawfully. And she wouldn't release it. She kept saying, oh, we're working with the FBI. We can't release, we can't release. Well, a judge ordered her to release it. And lo and behold, it showed that that cop murdered that boy. And she all of a sudden scrambled and started charging the cop. Well, Kim Foxx came in and ran against her and ran her out. And it's not just about police killings. Kim Foxx is now implementing policies and practices that are reducing racial disparities. She just, issued a policy that's getting all these folks who were locked up on money bonds in Chicago for minor offenses, getting them released. She's a prosecutor, but she's doing it because she's got a progressive mindset. Aramis Ayala in Orlando came out and said, I'm not seeking the death penalty in these death penalty cases because the death penalty is racist, it's classist, I'm not doing it. Of course, Governor Rick Scott then removed her from all of the cases in her jurisdictions where the death penalties are, but now she's suing the governor. It gets messy, but the point is that we got to get good progressive people in position so they can implement the policies, because if you don't have those folk in there, it doesn't matter what the laws are. How are we looking with time? I am, but do we have time for the signing? Because some people
book signing. So if you are in line and you can ask the fastest question, you get to ask it. If not, we'll ask it at the book.
Okay.
How you doing, ma'am?
Hi.
I'm 24 years old, and I mentor a young group of teenage boys, black boys, and I'm 24 years old, and I mentor a group of young black teenage boys and girls, and they've become desensitized to the videos of police brutality. And I just get tired and weary of just talking to them and trying to teach them different ways of how to replace the system of white supremacy with a system of justice. So are there any ways that, you could tell me that I could just tell them how they could, grow up and replace the system, replace it with justice? So
what I say to you is keep doing what you're doing, right? Because, a lot of times young people in particular, they get discouraged. Old people do too. But you're making a difference. You might think you are. You may get discouraged because you're hearing those kids saying the things they're saying. But they're getting it because you're there and you're mentoring them. And it's making a difference even though you don't realize it. So I'm just telling you to keep doing it. And maybe we can take maybe a couple of questions. We're not going to be able to get everybody. Let me take one more because I think we're losing people. I'll take
my
one
question is actually very similar to his,
Yeah.
because I helped establish a black student union within my school, and one thing that constantly came up was that you're considered guilty instead of innocent, and you're never considered innocent until proven guilty. And there's a lot of very interested young people looking to change the system, but they don't know how.
Right.
So for people going into college or choosing their new career path, what would be the most necessary part for them? What is the field that needs the most adjustment? Where are the minds needed the most?
Great question. And what I'll say, you say to them what I say to my law students when they come to me and say, I want to do something in criminal justice system, but I don't know whether I want to be a defense attorney or a prosecutor. And what I say to them is, I was a defender. Everybody thinks I want everybody to be public defenders, and we need more good public defenders. But we also need good prosecutors. So I say to them, tell me what your gut is. If you find yourself, I want to be a defender, go and be the best defender you can be to help free people. If you want to be a prosecutor, go read my book, Arbitrary Justice, so you can figure out how to be a progressive prosecutor. Use that power to do good. And it's not just criminal justice. There's so many opportunities out there for young people today, and organizations out there that are doing positive and progressive things. whatever they are interested in, whether it's the arts, as someone mentioned, whether it's policy, whether it's history, whether it's technology, go and do what's in their heart to do. And all of those things can be used to promote social justice. All of them, right? Whatever they're interested in, be the best they can be in it. And there are avenues out there and organizations out there that can help them to promote justice. And I would encourage you to encourage them to do that. So thank you all very much.